morning.
Good morning.
So right now we're in this little mini 2-week series right now, going through obscure books in the Bible, Bibles that we never read about, or books that we don't know anything about. And last week we covered the book of Philemon, which is definitely obscure, it's definitely up there. But today, this week, I would argue, the book that we're going to cover today is the number one most obscure book of the Bible. And it's so obscure, people don't even know how to pronounce it. It is so weird. Nobody reads this book. Today, we're going to cover the book of Habakkuk. So, go ahead and turn there in your Bibles. There in Habakkuk. It's over the very end of the Old Testament between Nahum and Zephaniah. So, on my last Sunday, there's nothing that I could think of better to preach on than Habakkuk. So that's what we're going to do today, Habakkuk. Now, even though Habakkuk is only 2 pages long, I can only remember maybe reading it twice in my life. One of which was this past week when I was preparing for today. And so I haven't read it a whole lot. Now Habakkuk is a part of what is called the minor prophets in the Old Testament. And the minor prophets don't get a whole lot of attention. They're among the most unread books in all the Bible. And the major prophets like Isaiah and Daniel, they get a lot more press than books like Habakkuk or Zephaniah or Haggai. And part of the problem I think that they have is the minor prophets they have a bit of a branding issue. I mean, they're called the minor prophets. When you read minor prophets, you read that it kind of sounds like these guys just don't have what it takes to make the big leagues, to be honest. Like, minor, they're not as important. They're not nearly as good as the other guys. Haggai is just a minor league prophet. He couldn't make it big time. But Jeremiah, he's a star in the big leagues. He made it. He's in the big leagues. But actually, it turns out that the reason why they're called the minor prophets, it has nothing to do with the significance or the importance of the book. Rather, it just has to do with how long the book is. And so the major prophets are no more important than the minor prophets, but they're just minor prophets because they're shorter. So the major prophets are huge, sometimes 60 chapters long, but the minor prophets are only maybe 1 to 2, 3 chapters long. So that's why they're called minor prophets. But out of all the minor prophets who are already really obscure, the most obscure definitely is Habakkuk. Definitely is the number one. We're given little to no information regarding Habakkuk, who was actually a real person. That's right. His mother named him Habakkuk. That's a real name that his mom gave him. But we know pretty much nothing about him compared to all the other prophets. We don't know who his father was, or what tribe he comes from, or what his hometown was. But the one thing we do know is that he was a prophet. We do know that. Now, a prophet is someone who would speak on behalf of God. The prophet was like the middleman between God and Israel. And God would tell his prophet something, and then it was his job to then go and tell the people, to go tell Israel. That was his job. Now, this is a hard job. Being a prophet was difficult. Prophets weren't really well liked because they had to tell people some really harsh things. They had to communicate to the people some things that they didn't want to hear. That's a hard job to fulfill. In fact, they were often killed for what they had to communicate for people. They were killed for being prophets. It was a rough job. So we live in America, and in our culture, I would say that a majority of people believe that having faith means to believe in a God who takes away all their problems. God wants us to be happy and comfortable. He wants us to have nice lives, nice and comfortable lives. That's the American version of faith. We have simplified God and made him into what we want him to be. God has to meet our expectations, and if he doesn't, then we don't have to do anything he says, and maybe he doesn't even exist. If God doesn't agree with who I think he should be, or how I should act, then I just don't want to deal with him. In our culture, we have oversimplified God and made him into a spiritual vending machine. Well, the book of Habakkuk asks the question, what about when God doesn't take away my problems? What about when God makes me uncomfortable? What about that? What Habakkuk actually discovers is that true faith is really more about embracing and holding on to God even when things are difficult and complicated and painful. Hang on to God even when things don't make sense, even when things don't seem fair. And that's how the book begins. It doesn't begin light and fluffy. There's no light introduction. He just jumps right into it. Habakkuk is wrestling with things that just don't seem to make sense to him, things that are really unfair. So let's read the beginning of Habakkuk, verses 1 through 4. The oracle that Habakkuk the prophet received. How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen, or cry out to you? Violence, but you do not save. Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hand in the righteous, so that justice is perverted. Does this not sound relevant to you? I don't know about you, but my news feed sounds something like this. 1 dead in synagogue shooting near San Diego. 11 killed in synagogue massacre in Pittsburgh. Over 200 killed in church bombings on eastern Sri Lanka. 12 people were killed when a gunman opened fire inside a nightclub in Thousand Oaks, California. Another terrorist attack by ISIS, this time killing people at a concert in Manchester, England. Another ambush of Christians in Egypt, killing and maiming dozens. Stabbings and shootings in America by people who do not seem like they're in their right minds. Another young black man killed without true cause. Another person escaping jail time even though the evidence seems obvious. Good and fair police officers unable to do their jobs because of the corruption of the few. Violence and injustice and strife and conflict. I mean, Habakkuk was saying these things back in 600 BC, but he might as well have just been doing it last week. We see these things all over the place. Right in the beginning of the book, Habakkuk cuts right to the chase. He's crying out to God, how long do we have to cry out to you? How long do you look at injustice? Are you going to do anything about this? Our world is a mess, and it seems like he's just sitting back, kicking his feet up, and he's just hanging out. He's having a grand old time while we suffer down here. And Habakkuk is crying out, what are you doing? Are you going to do something about this? I very often pray these same things. I ask these same questions to God as lovers of God and followers of Jesus. We should hate injustice. It should make us sick. We should cringe at people who are being inflicted with pain and torture. We should cry over death and destruction, because that was not God's design. Let me give you some context here for Habakkuk to understand his situation. So hundreds of years before Habakkuk was ever around, God chose the people of Israel to carry his message. He instructed them to worship him and only him as Lord. And he told them to care for the poor and love those who were lost. And he said, I will protect you and provide for you. And that is their covenant. However, if you've read any of the Old Testament, you would know that the Israelites had a really hard time with this. They had a really hard time following God, particularly in the area of not worshiping anything other than God. They created idols of calves and idols made of gold, and they worshiped those instead. But for hundreds of years, God remains faithful and chases after these cheating people. He chases after them. He doesn't stop. But finally, it seems that God just throws his hands out. And he allows the nation of Israel to be divided into two different and opposing kingdoms. You have the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. But this still doesn't get their attention. They're still being unfaithful to God. So do you remember a couple weeks ago when we were talking about Jonah, the city that Jonah was told to go to? Do you remember what city that was? It was Nineveh. And Nineveh is the capital of Assyria. That's the capital of Assyria. And those same people, the Assyrians, are taking over the northern kingdom of Israel. They've conquered the northern half of Israel, and they're right on the border of taking over the southern kingdom, which is where Habakkuk is. So he watched all of his friends, all of his brothers and sisters get destroyed and murdered in the northern kingdom, and now they're ready about to do the same thing to them in the south. The Assyrians are evil cannibals, horrible people, and they're about to take over Habakkuk's land. And Habakkuk watches, and he's terrified. He doesn't know what to do. He cries out to God, why are you allowing these godless and evil people to win and prevail? Why is this happening? Why are you allowing this violence to take place? What are you going to do? Are you going to save us or not? Where are you in this? The very questions that Habakkuk asked God are the same questions we ask today. Moving on in the text, we see that amazingly God answers Habakkuk, but his answer doesn't really clarify anything. Actually, it probably makes it more confusing. Look at verse 5. Look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed. For I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. Then when we read verse 5, we think, all right, God is going to do something amazing. He's going to do something fantastic. He's going to send like this amazing tidal wave to come and destroy all the Assyrians. It's going to be amazing. He's going to show up, and all the people in the southern kingdom are going to be saved. This is going to be great. He's going to do something awesome. But that's not what he tells Habakkuk. Verses 6 through 11, let's read. He says this, I am raising up the Babylonians, the ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwelling place is not their own. They are a feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like a vulture swooping to devour. They all come bent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. They deride kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all fortified cities. They build earthen ramps and capture them. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on. Guilty men whose own strength is their God. I'm sure when God said this to Habakkuk, he was like, excuse me? You said what? You said, I'm raising up the Babylonians. You're going to actually help the enemy of Israel? Like, these are God's own words. That's what he said to him. That doesn't make any sense. He's probably crying, how can you do this? What are you doing? This makes no sense. God straight up told Habakkuk that he's going to allow the Assyrians to kill them. And that it's in their best interest, actually, that this happens. You know, in our culture today, we love our oversimplified God. We love the God who, when there's a sickness and pain, he says, be healed. When he says, be still, we love that. We love those things, those simple things. We love when God delivers us from injustice. Because that's Hollywood. That's what sells tickets. That's what people love. But we have a hard time understanding that sometimes God chooses to deliver us through struggles rather than delivering us from them. Sometimes he puts things in our path that he knows are going to be painful and hard. But he knows that it's actually in our best interest that these things happen. And you know, some people really don't like it when God tells us these confusing things. We think that we have to know everything that God tells us. It all has to make sense to me. But actually, it doesn't. When God tells them to do something they don't want to do, they abandon God altogether. Because God would never ask them to do something that they wouldn't approve of. We've seemed to have forgotten that we're not God, but he is. We are not God, but he is. He is the one with the eternal perspective. Not us, not me, not you. He is. Honestly, we better hope that God tells us things that we might disagree with or things that make us uncomfortable, because that means it's probably him speaking. Because he knows better than we do. If, when you read the Bible, you're only affirming your own opinions and you feel more righteous, you're probably misreading it. We need to remember that we are not God and he is. We need to learn that he has the eternal perspective and not us. But how can we trust him when he tells us things like he told Habakkuk? How could Habakkuk trust God even though he told him that he would allow the Assyrians to conquer his people? Last week, for our communion meditation, we looked at Psalm 16, and it's actually the same text that I read this morning for the scripture reading, which is a prophecy that alludes to Jesus' resurrection. I'm going to read it again. It says this, "Therefore my heart is glad and my tongue rejoices. My body also will rest secure, because you will not abandon me to the grave, nor will you let your Holy One see decay. You have made known to me the path of life. You will fill me with joy in your presence, with eternal pleasures at your right hand." I don't know about you, but I think it's pretty stinking cool that God wrote this down in like 1000 BC about what would happen in 30 AD. I think that's pretty crazy. I think that's pretty cool. I think we forget that God has a plan. He's always had a plan, and he always will have a plan. He's got things under control. He predicted that Jesus would come and die and resurrect because it was all in his plan. He's got things figured out. Jesus wasn't a plan B. This is what he had planned all along. He knows what's going to happen. He's got it under control. Scripture like Psalm 16 shows that God is in control. But sometimes God's plan doesn't make sense to us because he's God and we're not. It's his plan, not ours. Honestly, the entire Bible is filled with God trying to communicate to his people. He's trying to save us, and we say, no thanks. God speaks an entirely different language than us because he's God and we're not. Jesus says in the gospel some really weird stuff. Blessed are the poor. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who are persecuted, for they will receive the kingdom. What? That's a completely different language. This is completely different. As humans, our initial reaction is to attack and kill and seize. But that's not what Jesus tells us. He tells us to be patient and gentle. Those are the words of God. It's the language of God, not the language of humans. God even went as far to send his only son to earth so he could save mankind. And what did we do when God sent his son to save us? We killed him. We killed him. We were so blind to our sin and brokenness that when God himself came down in the form of man, we couldn't recognize him, and instead, we crucified him. The Jews in the first century were waiting for a Messiah to come. But when the real Messiah actually came, he didn't meet their expectations, and so they decided to kill him. They rejected him. The Jews were expecting a king to come to take over Rome and lead them to victory. They were expecting a Messiah that would come and take over the world by force. That's what they wanted. But instead they got Jesus, who said, "Blessed are the meek. Blessed are the poor." They didn't like that. Instead of picking up a sword, Jesus said that the way to victory is to be persecuted. Instead of being the one who persecutes, be the one who is persecuted. That doesn't even make sense. They didn't want that, so they killed him. But God knew it would happen, because he wrote in Psalm 118, "The stone the builders rejected has become the capstone." We need to learn that sometimes we don't even know what we need. We don't have a clue what it is we actually need sometimes, but God does, because he's constantly pursuing us, constantly trying to tell us what that thing is. God's plan is so much greater than anything we could imagine. We think we know what we need, but we don't. So Shane Wood is a professor at Ozark, and he shared about how a few years ago he went around Russia lecturing at different universities. And he did this with his friend who's a pastor in India, the country of India. And so Shane is a Revelation scholar. He's a PhD in the book of Revelation. And some of you that were here for Sunday school, whenever we went through Revelation, I think it was last year, Shane is the one with the long hair in the videos that we watched. And so Shane and his friend from India went around Russia to different universities and lectured. And Shane lectured on Revelation, the book of Revelation. And his friend in India lectured on the persecuted church in India. And he shared about how people are suffering in India for their faith. And so, they traveled together for about a month. And so, they traveled to multiple universities, and they sat in on each other's lectures multiple times. And finally, Shane shared some of the pictures that his pastor from India would share. Some of the videos that he would share were just graphic, grueling, and terrifying, honestly. And after the fifth or sixth time of watching him explain how India is being persecuted, how Christians in India are being persecuted, he just had to share with him how he was feeling. And so he was like, "Man, is there anything I can pray for you about? Is there anything, what should I pray about for the church in India?" And he said, he continued on, he said, "Obviously, I would pray for the persecution to stop, but, is there anything else?" And he stopped him. He interrupted him. And he said, "Why in the world would you pray for that? Why would you pray for the persecution to stop?" He said, "Don't pray for that. Don't pray for it to stop, but rather pray that we would have stronger backs to endure it. Don't pray for it to stop, but pray that we could overcome it." The church in India is spreading like wildfire. Why do you think Christianity spread so fast in the first century of the Roman Empire? Because they were persecuted. As humans, we look at persecution and we say, "That's bad, we need to stop that." But God turns something that's a negative and turns it into a positive. God's language is not like our own. God takes this horrible, evil thing and he turns it into an opportunity. That's amazing. That's what God does. And just like Habakkuk, sometimes God wants to deliver us through our suffering rather than from it. We learn most from painful experiences in our past. So how can we trust God in the midst of persecution? How can the church in India trust God through persecution? How can we go through tough times and trials? How can we trust God during hard times? We can trust him through our suffering because he suffered first. This is so important. We can trust him because he suffered first. Other religions of the world worship gods who are immune to suffering. Buddhists worship Buddha. Hindus worship millions of deities who would never suffer. They would never have to suffer. But we worship Jesus Christ, who was beaten and tortured and persecuted and ultimately crucified on a cross. He was murdered in the most humiliating way possible. We can withstand suffering because Jesus experienced the worst possible suffering. But he didn't experience it. He didn't just experience it. He didn't just die, but he overcame it. He was crucified and died and overcame death. He rose again 3 days later. We can overcome our suffering because Jesus overcame it first. John Stott says something beautiful in one of his books. He says this: I could never myself believe in God if it were not for the cross. In the real world of pain, how could one worship a God who was immune to it? He says, I've entered many Buddhist temples in different Asian countries and stood respectfully before the statue of Buddha. His legs crossed, his arms folded, his eyes closed, the ghost of a smile playing round his mouth, a remote look on his face detached from the agonies of the world. But each time, after a while, I've had to turn away. And in imagination, I have turned instead to that lonely, twisted, tortured figure on the cross. Nails through hands and feet, back lacerated, limbs wrenched, brow bleeding from thorn pricks, mouth dry and intolerably thirsty, plunged in God-forsaken darkness. He says, that's the God for me. That's the God for me. I worship a God who didn't detach himself from us, but instead chose to suffer among us, alongside us. He came down and suffered alongside us. And it is because of that, and only that, that we can go through whatever we're going through. Because he suffered first, and he suffered way worse than we did. He knows what it's like. It's because of that suffering that the church in India can prevail. That the church the underground church in China can prevail. That the church in Africa can prevail. Those dying for their faith can prevail because Christ died himself for us. That is beautiful. The world sees Jesus' crucifixion and they see embarrassment and humiliation. But God looks at Jesus' crucifixion and he sees a solution to mankind. God's ways are much different than ours, and we have to remember that we are not God. He is. When we become confused and worried about the future, cling to God because he has your best interest in mind. We can withstand suffering because he suffered first. Let's pray. God, thank you for being different than all the other false gods in our world. Thank you for choosing compassion. Thank you for coming down in the form of human and coming alongside us and suffering with us. You know what it's like. It's because of that that we can live on. We can continue to live through trials and heartache. God, I pray that whenever we're going through things that are confusing and don't make any sense, that we can look to you. We can cling to you and pray to you. And know that you have our best interests in mind, and that no matter what we're going through, you know what's at the end. You know that you will protect us. You will have our backs. Thank you so much for that gift. Thank you so much for the crucifixion. Thank you so much for the resurrection.